This is the Dollemore Daily.
Hi, I'm Mike Greiner from the Democratic Activist Channel, and I'm sitting in for Jesse for a few days while he's moving from California to D.C., so he's better able to cover the national political scene. But of course, the news never stops, so let's talk about it today. One item that jumped out at me today is that a Canadian political scientist, Thomas Homer Dixon. He's the executive director of the Cascade Institute at Royal Roads University in British Columbia. And he's warning Canadians that they need to be prepared for the potential collapse of the United States democracy. The warning that he's sending is that by 2030, the United States could collapse into a right-wing dictatorship. And he's afraid of a future much like what we saw in the TV show The Handmaid's Tale, where Canada is left as a democratic bulwark against an America that has become a right-wing dystopia. Homer Dixon has a basis for his predictions, unfortunately. The increasing importance of money in American politics and the way that we have elevated that above political participation in any other way, really, has made it so that the very wealthy have a thumb on the scale. That in of itself makes the United States not really a democracy anymore, where we have one person, one vote. And that doesn't even take into account the partisan lean that we have as a result of the U.S. Senate and the Electoral College essentially giving increased weight to smaller states that are controlled by Republicans. What's more is that Republicans have essentially gerrymandered their way into a congressional majority, which unless something changes pretty dramatically, they're expected to get even if all the votes stay the same way that they were 2 years ago or even 4 years ago when Democrats won the House. These efforts that Republicans are passing at the state level have essentially made it so that Republicans remain in power even when they don't get a majority of the votes. Again, we're no longer a democracy at that point anymore. And that's what we're seeing in state after state right now. And that's on top of the fact that essentially Republican legislatures are trying to disempower people, make it harder for people to vote at a time when really we should be making it easier for people to vote. Finally, we have a Supreme Court that has become completely unattached to the wishes of the American people. It's essentially become a partisan body that cares no longer about its own legitimacy in the American democracy. The Supreme Court, of course, is dominated by Republicans now, virtually all of whom were appointed by presidents who did not win the popular vote. Appointed by Donald Trump, of course, one position of which was essentially stolen from the Democrats when the Republicans refused to even hold a hearing on Merrick Garland's nomination for the Supreme Court, and the other of which was again essentially stolen, where Republicans pushed it through the Senate with merely days left before the election. And while one might expect these people to kind of move cautiously given the circumstances under which they're appointed, what we're finding instead is that they're pushing to move aggressively to attack things like abortion rights and voting rights. Homer Dixon's not the only political scientist who's worried about the future of our country. American political scientists Jennifer Dixon at Georgia State University and her co-author Ben Press are circulating a research paper that talks about pernicious polarization and looks at the level of polarization that we have in the United States and compares it to what has been experienced in other countries that experienced small d democratic crises. What they found is that no country has survived with such high polarization over such a long period of time and survived as a democracy. Now, I had predicted this becoming an issue years ago, and at the time people thought that I was being hysterical, but now I think it's becoming increasingly evident that this is a real concern. I mean, the fear is that America could become authoritarian in all but name, as they put it. Don't believe it could happen? Well, hey, look at what's happened in Hungary, a country close to my heart that I visited as a child because my father actually was an immigrant from Hungary. In Hungary, for those who missed it, Viktor Orban, their prime minister, has just been endorsed by Donald Trump, if you can believe it, in his re-election campaign. Orban has become something of a cause célèbre among right-wing politicians and pundits for the way that he turned Hungary into a right-wing dictatorship without really changing the appearance of its democracy. After all, he and his party are still elected, right? Except for the fact that under his leadership, his party, Fidesz, has essentially turned its Supreme Court into a political tool. That they have essentially made it so that the media are unable to stand up to them, and even chased a university that was doing research that disagreed with the positions that Orban was taking. They chased that university out of the country. Does any of this sound familiar? Well, you don't even need to look all the way to Hungary for an example of where you can see American democracy being twisted into something that is very anti-democratic. I mean, economist Paul Krugman called Wisconsin Hungary by the Great Lakes, and he had good reason to. Yes, people who criticize Krugman are saying, hey, Tony Evers, the Democrat, won the governorship there. Yes, but what ended up happening is before he was sworn into office, the legislature, which is controlled by Republicans, of course, ended up attacking the powers that were granted to him. A similar thing happened here in Michigan before our democratically elected Governor Gretchen Whitmer took office. In what amounted to a power grab, the legislature in Wisconsin took power away from the governor and granted it to itself. And you have to remember that the people of Wisconsin voted 54 to 46% in favor of the Democrats in the legislature, and yet as a result of gerrymandering, the Republicans maintained 64% of the assembly seats, a supermajority that basically allows them to do anything they want, despite the will of the voters. Unless we do something dramatic at the national level, I think that's the kind of future that we can expect to see in the United States. And an even scarier example is raised by political scientist Barbara Walter, who wrote a book, How Civil Wars Start. And when her book was published in 2018, she was accused of fear-mongering. But she says that really the problem is we've got a failure of imagination of thinking about what a civil war is all about. I mean, our vision of the Civil War is colored by our own experience in our own Civil War. We imagine the soldiers in the trenches and the dying horses and the people losing their limbs. But it doesn't have to be that way, she points out. More likely, what we could see is a very decentralized civil war, one in which roving bands of right-wing militias essentially try to impose the will of the minority upon the rest of the country through intimidation. And we already see that happening with right-wing militias showing up at school board meetings, for crying out loud. This behavior has prompted political scientist Keith Boykin to say that America is in a cold civil war already. We have a chance to avoid this future, and really, the time to address it is ticking away. Chuck Schumer just today announced that he's going to bring to the floor of the Senate a measure to allow some carve-out of the filibuster rule to allow voting rights legislation to pass. And President Biden has stated that he's in favor of such a move. My hope is that Biden and Schumer are correct, that Democrats are finally at a point, especially in this month where we're remembering the January 6th insurrection and Martin Luther King Day later in the month, that we need to take steps to protect American democracy. One piece of legislation, which was actually negotiated by Senator Joe Manchin, would do a lot toward addressing some of these issues. And my hope is that, especially with Senator Manchin in the leadership role of this legislation, that we'll be able to get something passed that will at least reduce the risk that these political scientists are pointing to. Well, if you agree with me or disagree with me, I'd love to see your comments down below. And if you could check out my channel, Democratic Activist, we'll link to that down below as well. I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.